Welcome. We're going to start in 1 minute. Alex will MC the session. I'm very grateful that he's agreed to do this. I'm Robert Bitarek. I run ICAS here at TUJ. Just a few things. If you have a phone, put it on vibrate. And also, if you want to be on our email list, feel free to give us your business cards, and you can also make a contribution to the program. And just one thing, I would of course like to thank our distinguished visitors. It's an enormous honor for us to have you here. This is the 7th time we've done this program, and it's always the highlight of the year at Temple University. So we're really, really grateful to you. And I'd like to thank the Foreign Ministry. I don't know if there's anybody from the Foreign Ministry here. For sponsoring this. And of course, as usual, the student workers, Enrico and Emily, for running everything. So Alex.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you to our distinguished and honored guests. It is an honor meeting you all, getting to know you, and hearing about these stories, your story, or your father's stories. They're really incredible tales that I think everybody's anxious to hear. So again, my name is Alexander Gonzalez. I'm the Vice President of the Veterans Club. On behalf of TUJ, we wish you a warm welcome, and we'll go ahead and kick it off. So we'll start with just by introducing yourself, maybe your branch of service, and a short story about your loved one. For yourself. Mr. Chamberlain, if you'd like to kick it off.
I was a combat medic during World War II in the Philippines during the battle for Bataan. We ran out of food and we ran out of ammunition, and the Japanese soldiers just, all they had to do was wait and walk in on us. Actually, what happened was we just starved ourselves out. I did 3.5 years as a prisoner of war, some of it in Bilibid prison in Manila, most of it at 3 different camps at Cabanatuan in the Philippines. Perhaps some of you have heard of the Cabanatuan camps. They were all death camps. Do you have any questions?
Mr. Chamberlain, we'll probably take the questions at the end.
Oh, okay.
But thank you very much. We'll introduce our next speaker, Ms. Pruitt.
I am Jean Pruitt. My husband was Charles, and after he was released and went home, he stayed in the Navy for 20 years, and but he never completely got over having nightmares. One of his latest nightmares, they changed a little. I was in the coal mine with him, and he couldn't get me out. I told him I didn't want to be in there to start with. But he grew up. We're from the same hometown. I did not know him until after he got home. I was friends with his sister, and I knew his parents, but I did not know him. And I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you very much.
Shirley Steele, raised in Ohio. Now I'm living in Montana. Wife of Ben Steele, former cowboy, ranch boy. Art saved his life. He started drawing with charcoal on the floor of Bilibid prison, came back, studied art, became a professor. Tears in the Darkness is about his life. He has a large collection of the experience at the University of Montana, the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. His sketchbooks are at the MacArthur Museum, in Norfolk, and they just named a school for him in Billings, Ben Steele Middle School.
Incredible.
My father was in the Philippines from the summer of 1940. I was born there in October of 1940. My mother and I left in May of 41. From the end of August of 41, he was in various places in the southern Philippines. Ended up in Mindanao, being on the staff of General Sharp. Was surrendered there on May 10th, 1942. All the prisoners of war were ordered to surrender. Nobody volunteered to surrender. So he was in the Val Penal Colony for not quite 2 years, and then shipped up to Luzon, went through Bilibid, went to Cabanatuan in June, and then in October went back to Bilibid, and then was loaded on the Arisan Maru, Arisan, with 1,780 other POWs, including Joe's dad. And I'll let Joe tell the story of the Arisan Maru.
I also was born in the Philippines. My dad joined the Army in 1932. He was immediately assigned to the 31st Infantry Regiment, which was home in Manila. And that's where a few years later, he met my mom, Spanish citizen, and they got married. And I'm the fourth child. But that my brother and two sisters were born in the Army hospital in Manila. When I was born, the Army hospital was in the jungles of Bataan, so I was born at home. And my dad was a prisoner, of course, of April 9th of 42, when they surrendered in Bataan, and was forced marched up to San Fernando, where they put them on the train cars, box cars, of which was put probably over 100 men in a car, and no heat, no air conditioning, no windows. It was when they got to the end of the line, they opened the doors, and everybody got out except the ones who had already passed away in the car. And there was quite a few of them had passed away because of the heat and the lack of air and the sickness that they had. So once he got to the camp, and then they moved him to Cabanatuan. And then in October, well, before then, he got notification of my birth. I was born March the 3rd of 42. And so sometime during the next year, he was able to make me a bracelet that says Daddy on one side, 3343. And then on the other side is my initials, J.W. Brown. And he was able to give that to a Catholic priest, German, who was working the camps. And he got it to my mom, and I've had it ever since. And I was fortunate that as a child, I never lost it or played with it and destroyed it. And I have it today. And then on the 24th of October, Asia Maru, which I mispronounced, but the same ship John's dad was on, perished, was sunk, and everybody except for 9 men survived the ship, and 8 of them made it home, but 1 died later in Japan.
My name is Mary Jane McCourt's Blaine. My father was John James McCourt. He was born in Arkansas. His family moved quite a bit. He ended up graduating from Abilene High School in Abilene, Texas, and enlisted in the Army. He had a knack for languages, and he liked electronics. I guess it was the most advanced thing, the way kids like computers today. So he ended up in the Signal Corps, and he did pretty well with it. He was quite a few places in the Philippines, but he ended up being surrendered on Corregidor. I remember my 21st birthday, he asked me how I was going to celebrate it, and for those in the States, the legal drinking age is 21. So you look forward to that, and you usually go out to a club, and I told him, I said, well, I'm going out to a club and hear a band and have my first legal drink. And he goes, that's the way you should spend a 21st birthday. And it didn't dawn on me until years later when I was going through his papers. He spent his 21st birthday at the 92nd Garage, which was just an asphalt stretch of ground with no facilities, one small water spigot, and he and 10,000 other soldiers were forced to stand on that asphalt in the Philippines, which is on the equator line, for 3.5 weeks before they were then moved over to the main island and ultimately brought to Japan. And so now whenever I think of somebody going out for their 21st birthday, it always tends to bring that little moment back with my father.
I'm Caroline Burkhart, and I'm the daughter of Thomas F. Burkhart. He was from Altoona, Pennsylvania, and was growing up in the Depression, and so there wasn't much work around, and he joined the Army Air Corps at Hamilton Field, California. He was in the Air Corps for a couple years, and then there's a little gap in the history, but he was made a first lieutenant in the Army Reserve and sent immediately to the Philippines. He died in 1972, so I have been piecing his story together for the last 15 years. He was at Fort McKinley outside Manila when the war started, and he was part of the 45th Infantry Philippine Scouts, which was an elite group that was part of the United States Army. It had Filipino enlisted men, and the officers were Americans. They were famous for their fighting spirit and their proficiency. He was captured on Bataan and went through the usual sequence most of the Americans did. He was in O'Donnell and then Cabanatuan, and late in 1942 was taken to Japan in the hold of the Nagato Maru. It took them from November 4th until the 25th, which was Thanksgiving. They sat in that hold with no water, very little food, and no sanitary facilities. So when they got to Japan, they had been acclimated to the tropics, and they had no heavy clothes. He went to another camp called Tanagawa, and then was switched to Zensuji, which was basically a propaganda camp. They had officers there, and he spent 29 months there. Then this camp had a lot of Allied prisoners in it. They had the Dutch, the New Zealanders, the Australians, and the British. So it was quite interesting life there, everyone trying to acclimate to each other. I'm very fortunate to come on this trip. It's been kind of a dream of mine, and tomorrow I will be able to go to Zensuji, the camp that he spent most time in, and that's going to be really wonderful. I'll get to see the campsite, and I'm going to be at a local library and the museum there. So that's really kind of brought the whole experience full circle for me, and I'm really thankful to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and all the people that have been our hosts through this trip. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take questions from the audience. Just keep in mind that this event is being recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, you can raise your hand, address your question, and I will repeat it back to them. For everyone else, though, please feel free to use the microphone in the middle. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Question for Carolyn. How have you been piecing together your father's story? What have you been doing to research?
We knew my father had written diaries, but at one point they disappeared. And finally, when my sister was moving out of her house, they were in the last box out of the house. So then we started taking these tiny little diaries and transcribing them and trying to put them in proper order so that we did have a good picture of his life in Zensuji and Rokoroshi, the camp he was in finally. So then I got interested in the whole story because he died in 1972, and I really never got to ask any questions. So I started going to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. I'm in Baltimore, so I don't live too far from there. And I also joined the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor and got very active in that. So most of us are active in that group, and we get together, and our conventions are seminars, research seminars, and the POWs speak to us. And so I have gradually put together my father's whole story. I've found some wonderful documents in the National Archives and different other places on the internet. It's just been an eye-opener to get the whole story.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. My name is Jeff, and I'm from Rhode Island, the smallest state. And I'd like to ask the panel, beginning with Mr. Chamberlain, whether you or your spouses or fathers visited Japan after the war, and if so, what impressions did you or they take away from the visit to Japan? Thank you.
I stayed in the military for 28 years, and yes, I did go back to Japan. I was stationed in Okinawa for 4 years. I took my family with me. I was able to come back to Tokyo. When I first saw Tokyo after the war, it was leveled. I was so amazed and surprised to see such a large city flattened out. Now that I've come back here and saw that you've rebuilt, I'm gratified that this war ended in a good way. I hope that we never have another war like that one. I pray to God every night. I'm not a religious man. I don't go to church, but I do say a prayer every night. And one of the things I say is I ask God to bless those men who left us and their families. I became a National Service Officer for the American Ex-Prisoners of War, and I've claimed, I wrote claims up for the ex-prisoners. Before that, I had gone to paramedic school, so I had a medical background, and I was able to write. And I put in a lot of claims, and I'm hopeful that those men, their wives, and their children benefited from that. Is there any more questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
My name is Alex. I'm from Chicago, and first I'd just like to say it's truly an honor to be in the same room as someone who's survived such horrific events. I was just curious as to like what your mindset was as this was happening, and how did you wake up every day and survive this horror around you?
You survived by guts and grit, the lady says. We ate many things that you would not expect people to eat. There were dandelions over there in the Philippines, and we picked dandelion greens. And I found a bunch. I was on the, we had a lot of diphtheria there, and as a child, I had developed and overcome diphtheria, so I volunteered for that diphtheria ward, and for two reasons. One is to help those men out. The other one is that the Japanese guards were deathly afraid of it and they wouldn't come near us. That was a gratifying experience. A lot of them died. A great deal of them died, actually. Before that camp closed up, there was over 5,000 people died, and they were buried out there. I understand now that they've been exhumed. Most of them were reburied in a national cemetery in Manila, and since then some of them have been sent home. I would be greatly gratified if the government decided to bring all of them home, exhume them and bring them home. Any more questions? I'll pass this along.
Well, I have a comment. He mentioned that he ate a lot of things that wouldn't. Well, my husband had a foxhole on Corregidor, and when he ran to get in it, it was occupied by a snake. So he just threw it over the cliff, and the ones that were stationed below the cliff ate it.
When asked how he survived, my husband would say, one day at a time. That's all you can do.
Mr. Whithurst.
Well, my dad told stories about being in the jungle and being just so hungry and being very weak. You have to remember that the United States could not bring supplies to the Philippines. They were trapped there, and there was no way to resupply them. So whatever was there was all they had to eat. So they ran out of medicine, they ran out of quinine, they ran out of food. They were put on half rations in January. And so when as the war progressed, they got hungrier and skinnier, and there was just a merry-go-round in the units. One would go to the hospital, one would come back, and everybody was going to the hospital. But my dad told me about eating snakes. They ate monkeys, and many men were put off by eating the monkeys because when they were in the stew pot, the little monkey hand looked an awful lot like a baby. So that wasn't too appetizing. He also ate a candle one time, and there was a general rule that when you were looking for food in the jungle, you could watch what the monkeys ate and eat what they had, what they would go for.
Good evening. My name is Jose. I'm from Puerto Rico. I spent 30 years in the Navy, just retired last year. Now I'm a student over here in Japan. As a serviceman, identify yourself. You know, I had a wife, I got kids, and I'd be very proud of my kids, my wife, for having the courage and the courage to come to this place and talk about their experiences. my takeaway is the healing process. You know, we hear now all these new words. People come back with a lot of PTSD, and how hard it is for these people to heal. I cannot imagine, you know, your parents or your husband's heal process after they come back from that experience. So you can share some of these experiences or advice that you can give us on how to deal with such experience and try to live with it. Thank you.
I've told about all I know to tell.
Well, art saved his life. As I said, he started to draw on the floor of Bilibid prison. He had been on the march, was in fairly good shape because he did not have malaria. And being a farm boy, he took a sock from a dead soldier, so he had always had dry feet. Some men took their shoes off because they had blisters, and that was the worst thing they could do, because they were really in bad shape and became infected. But he knew how to take care of himself on that. He had a stab wound from trying to help a fellow prisoner who was falling, and if they fell and couldn't get up, they were either bayoneted or shot. But he had to go on and couldn't, because the guard was stabbing him. At O'Donnell, he was on the burial detail to escape all of the death. The Filipino men died more than the Americans. He volunteered for the Tayabas Road detail, which was the worst experience for him outside of the hell ships. About 300 men went in to build a road by hand in southern Luzon during the rainy season with no shelter. The rice was cooked in wheelbarrows, and the Japanese forces were upstream with their horses. So of course they all got dysentery as well as the malaria, and then he had an injury in his foot. They were taken, 50 survived, they were taken to Bilibid prison, which was wonderful for him because he had shelter. And the hospital ward was simply another cell block. They had tatami mats, and the medics and the officers from Cavite Naval Base were there, and they were horrified at the state of these men. They had a little medicine they had smuggled in, so he had sulfa for his wound. And a buddy was assigned to the kitchen and would bring him some scraps, some garbage, which saved his life. He later they became very close, and the buddy came out to Montana. He introduced him to a family friend's daughter, and they married. And at the man's funeral, Ben gave the eulogy, and he looked at all the children, and he says, "I'm responsible for all of you." But Ben came home with a mission after the hell ships, and then a year in a coal mine, a Minamachi. We're going there this end of this week to the mine. And he came home with this mission to tell the story. So they wouldn't let him go to school with the GI Bill for a year. He was attached to a hospital in Spokane, the Army hospital. And they also said, don't get married, but of course they all did. And he finally was able to go to the Cleveland Institute of Art, recommended by the chaplain who had tried to save his original drawings. But he immediately started to redraw all these scenes, and when he went to apply to the art school, they said, "Oh, we're sorry. It's a very prestigious school." They said, "Our quota is filled," but then they said, "But we'll look at your portfolio." So they looked at these drawings, and the engineers had helped him with perspective, and they were so detailed. And he says, "But we'll make room for you." So he studied a diploma, 4 years, another year for a bachelor at Kent State, and then he followed his favorite professor to study mural painting at Denver U. All of the years that he taught really more than art. He taught forgiveness because everybody knew his story. And every student became his friend. He was a mentor as much as an art teacher. And while he has this collection, he also did wonderful watercolors of Montana. And I think he was teaching people about the land too, because he grew up on a ranch. He knew every animal, every bird. And when he was in the 2nd grade, his aunt was his teacher, and she came home by the house one day, and she said, she was in tears. She said, "I can't teach Bud," that's what they called him. "There's something wrong with Bud. He's not learning." Well, his mind was outdoors. And he was learning from the land. And that was very important to him.
Thank you very much. So again, the question was the healing process, and I don't know if anybody else would like to answer that question.
Several years ago, we went to I live in Tennessee, and about 150 miles away, we had a hospital. And we had gone to the hospital to a seminar where they were interviewing some of the POWs. And one of their last speakers was very comical, and as I was walking out of the auditorium, there was a man standing there. And I made a comment about the man that was so funny. And he said, "Well, I was not a prisoner of war, but I was in the occupation group." And he said, "One day I looked up and there was 8 scarecrows walking toward me." And he said, he went over and he told them that they were under arrest. And they said, "We don't care. We'll be in the brig and we'll have food." So he said, "Well, your sentence is go to the mess hall and eat all you want. What are the chances of us running across each other?" That was a very touching. And he said, "I was in hopes I'd see one." I said, "He's standing right there."
Tomorrow or the next day, we're going to visit a mine, a lead and zinc mine owned by Mitsubishi Corporation. I worked that mine. It was a terrible experience. Many of us died there. There's a lot of things I could say, and my mind is in a jumble about what to say. But I pray that there will never be another war like that one. Is there any questions about this now?
Thank you, Mr. Chamberlain. I do have a question that I'd like to ask, especially maybe from some of the veterans that are here and that even gone to combat. This is a difficult subject to talk about, but many of us that have spent time with our brothers and sisters in the armed forces also know that there's a lot of positive experiences that we've taken back from our experiences overseas. So I've always been curious to hear about some of the more positive experiences, whether it was during the imprisonment or in the moments before or after, that have maybe helped kind of shape the way you look at the world.
Well, there's many things that I could say about that. And like I said, my mind is in a jumble right now. Probably one of the main things that I can think of is that you will eat anything that will help sustain life. You would be surprised. I remember at Cabana Tawan one time, there was a group of wild Filipino dogs, and they have a lot of wild dogs over there. They didn't make it. You can imagine. We made it. Of course, it didn't last long. There's also wild pigs over there. They didn't make it. It's amazing what you will eat. You'll eat everything on an animal except the hair. You'll bleed them out. That will go in the stew. You will clean the innards out. I mean, you will wash them out. Then you'll scrape the fat out. You'll use the fat. You'll dice up what's left as tiny as you can, and you'll eat that. I remember one time I got the tail of the animal. You never tasted anything so good as a tail. Piece of tail like that. Any more questions?
It would appear Mr. Chamberlain has taken over the role of MC. He's doing a much better job. But
well, you know, if you can't be humorous about something, you know, what's the use?
exactly. Well said.
Humor kept us going, and I certainly cannot tell you what kind of humor we had. And I wouldn't want to, I wouldn't dare to. And this group wouldn't stand for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chamberlain. Would anybody else like to share positive experiences or Mr. Chamberlain? I think Ms. Steele's trying to grab the mic spotlight from you.
Ben said they ate everything on Bataan but when they ran out of food. And knowing that he was a Montana ranch boy, he went out in front of the lines at night a few times with men, shot a caribou, they dressed it out, and took it back and ate it. But he's right, they ate everything. The ones who couldn't didn't make it.
Result of starving for so many years, I think a lot of us as children saw some of that in our own lives. We always had to eat everything on our plate. There was no waste. And my father was still in the Army, so he would drop by the commissary on the way home just about every night. We had 2 refrigerators, and they were fully stocked. Downstairs, we had at least 5 gallons of milk and probably 5 or 6 kinds of ice cream. The canned goods were in this great big cabinet, and they were all alphabetized, so he knew exactly where his food was. So we always had plenty of food in our house, and there was never any waste.
Hi, my name's Scott, and both my parents were in World War II in the Marine Corps. And so growing up as a child, I was made very much aware of the atmosphere that existed in the U.S. during that time. And all of you have lived through such a big change in attitude toward Japan since the end of that war, since the war, and now coming up today. And I think it's quite remarkable that the Foreign Ministry has organized this program, and so I'd be interested to know, what has this program meant to you, and has it affected how you've, it seems as if your attitude probably has changed in the last many decades, and I'd be interested to hear what you've gained from this program, because it seems quite extraordinary.
It's working now.
It's working, it's working.
Could you restate that question?
Feeling about Japan changed since 1945 to now?
We've had a great deal of changes here. This city is an example of it. Following World War II, this city was leveled. Look at it now. What are we doing here?
Well,
Why are we here? That's your answer. Each one of you know it. If you don't know it, you don't belong here.
Yep. Thank you. Perhaps, I think Ms. Blaine would like to say something.
I've stated before, my family is pretty much a classic American melting pot. We have quite a few different creeds, and just about, I think, all the races are in our family. So I have an aunt who was 13 years old, Japanese, lived in Japan during the war, but she's, from knowing her from the time I was a little child on, I just couldn't conceive of the sort of behavior that manifested among the military. And my father didn't see it that way either. He always stressed, you have to take each person for who they are. You can't just condemn everybody for what a group has done and for what a group is pushing forward. And I think I can talk with it more evenly and with less emotion when I'm talking with these people, because we have it in common, or with my family. But it's kind of difficult for me to talk about it here, because you've all been so generous and gracious, and it's just very lovely people, all of you. And I think one reason my dad didn't talk to it very much about it with us is he didn't want us to know those feelings of fear and sadness. And I kind of hesitate talking about it here, because you're all so lovely. I don't want you to know those kind of sad feelings either.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to have any questions for our guests? Please.
Good evening. I'm originally from Colombia. I'd like to ask all of you about the process of forgiveness, and more concretely, how difficult it is to forgive when the perpetrator has not asked for forgiveness.
Well, my husband did not have any animosity against the people. It was war, and it was difficult for you, and it was difficult for us. And it's never good to have war. It's never good. And he first talked about his experience that no one believed him. They accused him of making up a tale. So he did not talk about it to anybody, not his children. He would talk to me some, but he wouldn't discuss it. Our closest friends did not know he was a POW, but after he told it one time and they accused him of lying, he wouldn't talk about it anymore. Till 1982, we joined the POW group, and that was great therapy for them because you didn't have to explain what you went through. They went through it also, so that was therapy for them. And he did not believe in holding bad thoughts about anybody because it's eats your heart out if you do. You never get over it.
Ben had to talk about it because every time he would show the drawings in the beginning before he did all the paintings, every time he would show them, he had to explain them. So he talked about it. The ones who came to the meetings, as she said, it was wonderful therapy, and they laughed. They laughed at all these situations. The ones who didn't come had problems with they never really got over it.
I think in our organization, we've come to see that many of the men would come to the meetings. Our organization was started in 1946 by the POWs themselves, and it has endured all this time, although back in 2009 they asked the descendants to take over the organization. And originally the men would sit around and talk to each other, and the wives would be over in the corner playing cards and bingo at these meetings. Eventually, the descendants started to intrude upon the meetings. People like me that didn't have a parent alive and just found the group by pure circumstance. And for a lot of years, the men would not talk to anybody. They wanted to spare their family these horrible conditions. There were certain stories that they would tell you, the funny stories or the interesting stories. In many, many cases, they taught their children to count in Japanese because at least twice a day the prisoners were lined up before they went out to work, and they were lined up again when they came back, and they had to count off, and God forbid anybody was missing or the count got messed up because they'd start again. So they had counted so many times that at one of the meetings that we had, everybody started saying, well, I can count in Japanese, and they all did. So we all started counting in Japanese together, and it was such a nice moment because we had all had a common experience of being able to count. We couldn't say anything else. So you'll see if you start researching this subject that there were a lot of books that started to come out in the 80s and 90s where men would finally be at peace enough within themselves that they could actually write the book, and it was a catharsis. They could get it out, and they realized that there were other people that would actually believe them now. It had been part of documented history, so it became so much easier when they were older to talk about it.
I guess just like a follow-up on that question is you said it took like 20, 30, 40 years for them to come to terms with it, but being children of POWs and having a more personal experience, how long, and of course Mr. Chamberlain can hop in too, like how long did it take that for the stories to get passed down for them to feel comfortable and come to terms with telling their own children maybe what happened?
my dad didn't really start telling us much about those days until he was in his 70s. And I took him to a chapter meeting. He apparently was commander of the Mid-Atlantic chapter. And I got to meet a lot of his co-POWs and watch them together, and they would tell little things. So just sitting there, keeping an eye on them and assisting their party, because these guys really liked to party when they were together. You could pick up bits and pieces, and I picked up more from him directly, going to that chapter meeting and just listening to them talk with each other. At home, once in a while he would say something, or once in a while something would trigger a negative response of some kind, but he didn't say much at home at all until I think towards the end he started talking more about it, because I think he knew he was coming to the end of his days. But prior to that, you didn't hear too much from him unless he was in the group, like with his ADBC friends.
Peace. If you are not a forgiving person, you are not living. Peace.
Thank you. John and Joe, I know you haven't had an opportunity to speak. I don't know if you want to share maybe your parents' testimony.
Well, I started getting to know former prisoners of war 15 years ago, and I was in the first class lounge in the Philippine Airlines first class lounge, waiting to fly back to the Philippines at the end of March of 2002. And there were two old Air Corps guys who had been prisoners of war at Nielsen Field, and they were talking about mutual acquaintances, and did you know so-and-so, and one name came up, and the other guy who knew him said, oh, he died 30 years ago, he couldn't deal with the rage. So all the guys that I knew, they found their way, whatever it was, and it was different for me, each one of them. They found a way to let enough of that go that they could go on living. And I learned a lot from them. And I'm very grateful to having known some of the finest human beings I've ever known who were former prisoners of war.
I have a little bit different perspective, maybe, because my mom was probably one of the first single mothers before the term was even brought about, because she never remarried. She raised 4 children. Our problem was basically growing up in a small farming community in Kansas. No one knew who or what a Filipino was. And because we were born there, we were always told in more of a scorn that, oh, they're the Filipinos. And it really, pardon my French, but it pissed me off, because we weren't, if I was, that'd be fine, but we were Spanish American, you know, and these people are so ignorant, you know, and small-minded that they just couldn't understand that. And so as I was growing up, I got to the point where I wouldn't tell anybody where I was born. I'm raised in Kansas. I'm from Horton, you know. And when I was in college, people in my fraternity and even other students that I got to know didn't know where I was born, because they just knew I was from Kansas. And it wasn't until actually about in 2005 when I found the first Bataan Death March, Memorial Death March in White Sands, New Mexico, that I started going there, and I was able to start talking. But anyway, in fact, bring it back a little bit, very comical in a way, but very sad, is the fact that when I went to my 50th high school reunion, one of my classmates said, well, who, you know, because I didn't have a name tag on, so I got there a little bit late and I didn't have a name tag, and they said, well, you know, she said, well, what's your name? It's been 50 years. I mean, I can understand. So I told her, I said, Brown, you know. And said, oh, well, which Brown? Because there was 2 Browns in the town, small town, and Mike was my brother's best friend. His dad owned a grocery store. And I said, he said, oh, the Kroger? I said, no. Oh, the other, oh, you're the Filipino. I said, oh. I said, I see you haven't got out of the county yet, have you? And just walked away, you know. Oh, pathetic. But anyway, that's, but since then, I've been able to tell people, and I'm proud to tell people I'm born in the Philippines, and if you have problems, that's tough.
I'm Mike. I'm from D.C., and I was previously a civilian in the Department of Defense. And just to sort of take it up to a more modern kind of situation that's, I think, very much related to all of your personal experiences and those of your husbands and your fathers. One of the difficulties we have today is that there's still a lot of disputes about history. In the war, in the events that preceded the war, between Japan and some of her neighbors, Korea, China, other countries as well too. And there seems to be a lot of disagreement about what happened and how it happened and so forth and who is responsible. And it seems that in the case of the American POWs, that it really took all of your fathers and your husbands and yourselves to use their inner individual fortitude to forgive, to achieve catharsis, and to reconcile over the long run. And it seems like they used all their powers to insulate their families, their wives, and their children from that. But the trouble, I think, in some of these other countries is that those who bore the suffering were not military fighting men. They were children, they were women, they were the elderly, they were those who didn't choose a path of the military life where such things do happen sometimes. Do you have any insight? Do you have any kind of thinking that might provide some path forward to that kind of broader kind of reconciliation in which the suffering was much more diffuse and still felt deeply, and for which forgiveness seems just as far off as it was in 1945? Thank you.
I served in Vietnam, and right now they're having that stories on that, which isn't. I don't know. I really don't know. I never had a problem with the Vietnamese people. Got quite a few friends now that were boat people that came over. Most of them improved themselves and really did a great job of education and follow up on that. Only one question I ever had was from a father. My son and his son were playing freshman football in Poway, California, and he asked me a question, and I talked to a lot of Vietnamese, and I never did. I was sort of surprised about this question. He asked me if I fathered any children while I was in Vietnam. I said no, I did not. So I just didn't ask him why he would ask that question, but I always had a feeling that he might have taken it personally because maybe something happened in his family. But I had no hatred or anything for them. It was just the person who might be shooting at me I didn't like, But and for all the people I've known since then, they don't have a problem. The Vietnamese don't have a problem with the Americans. that I've been associated with. I know one was a deputy sheriff who graduated from University of San Diego, which is a very prestigious university, and he was one who had came over on the boat, but he's very improved himself, and you know, but he was a smart individual anyway to begin with. You know, they're very intelligent people, and the same way with what's going on over in Iraq. You know, individually, there's no problem. It's just when we were fighting the war over there, that was one thing, because there was army against army, and today it's not army against army. It's, you know, philosophy or religious belief against the world, it seems like. But I don't want to get on that. But anyway, I'm not sure if I answered your question or not. I'm sorry if I hadn't.
My stepdaughter's laughing. I'm talking so much. I've always had, and Ben has always had, even right after the war, when he could not look at an Asian face, but he has always had compassion for the people. And we have always felt governments got us into a lot of things we don't agree with. And somehow there was no control over this, the war. The authors of the book Tears in the Darkness, in which Ben is the main character, by Michael and Elizabeth Norman. Michael gave me a book written by a Japanese school teacher. He taught at a small school for boys in Tokyo. And it tells about how short of food they were, how they could hardly feed the students, and how he felt for these young boys. And one by one, they would have to leave and go to war. And towards the end, he knew that most would not come back. It's a very revealing book.
Hello, my name is Magda Osumia. I work for the Japan Times, and I'm not American, I'm Polish originally. I would like to ask you how, any of you, how you evaluate the Japanese government's handling of war, war responsibility issues. And my second question is, what kind of lessons can young Japanese people draw from that chapter in history? Thank you.
I think that there are many ways to reconciliation, and people have their own opinions. For a long time, the prisoners of war tried to get the Japanese government to reconcile the fact that they had been held as slave laborers, tortured, beaten, everything you can imagine. And the POWs in the early 2000s tried to sue the Japanese government, but our government had made a treaty with Japan back in 1951 that prohibited any kind of legal action like that. So that monetary help was not going to happen. So for many years, there was a pursuit of an apology. And it has come in very different ways from very different people. At one of our conventions back, I believe in 2009, the Japanese ambassador came and gave what most people accepted as an apology for what had happened during World War II. There are purists who say that maybe his language was not what we would expect because the nuances of Japanese are quite different. So as years go by, the apology is less of an issue, and we're all working together. They're bringing us over here to meet you and to help us reconcile what has happened to our parents and to our husbands, and in Mr. Chamberlain's case, what happened to him. So I think that it's an ongoing process, and we're really hopeful that these trips to Japan can continue and that we can reach out to people, the Japanese people, get to know them, they can meet us. And the problem is, I think, when you ignore history, you are doomed to repeat it. And in both countries, young people are not taught about the Japanese, American, and Allied prisoner experience. It's utterly glossed over in both countries. They have a very small World War II unit. They learn about Pearl Harbor, D-Day, the Holocaust, and the bomb. And that's all they learn. There's nothing in between. So it is something that needs to be understood on both sides of the water.
Sorry. How did you feel when you came back to the United States, or in the case of or your husband's or your father's? What was the impression? Did you feel that most Americans understood what you had lived through? How was it, in a way, to come back, having suffered so much, to a country which itself had not, of course, been bombed or whatever, where the war was perceived essentially, as first and foremost as it was, as a great victory, and there was very little focus on the POWs. So I wonder, how was the return to America in 1945?
Not good. The problem was that we would go out to a bar. We'd have a few too many. Somebody would make a remark that really made your skin crawl. I got into a lot of fights in bars until one day a guy come up and slapped me on the back. I reached up and I grabbed him, I pulled him over, I hit him with my fist, and I hit him in the chest with my knee. The table collapsed and we both went down. It excited the bartender, and here he come with a club in his hand. When I got to looking at this guy, it was a kid I'd gone to school with, and all he was doing was slapping me happily on the back. And I thought he was attacking me, because that's a way during war you sometimes were attacked like that. So it's difficult to say exactly what you want me to say. War is hell. Would you repeat your question and I'll go after it again?
Thank you.
There's a purpose for me asking you to repeat your question.
Yeah, no, so the question was, how was the return? How did you feel other Americans understood or did not understand what you had gone through?
They did not understand it. They absolutely did not understand that somebody else had been attacking you, that somebody else had been starving you for years. They did not understand that somebody had been using you as a slave for years, because nobody in America ever experienced those things. If you don't experience something, you have a hard time understanding it. Think about how many things in life you've scratched your head over. Do you understand what I'm saying now? Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think there's any way that the Japanese I can understand what they went through any more than our POWs could explain what they went through. You cannot comprehend it unless you've had that experience. It's hard to understand what went on in all concerns.
The men who were treated as heroes did not feel like heroes. They felt they failed. They also felt guilty that they came home and the others did not. They had this to contend with.
Thank you.
Yes.
You also have to remember that the war was happening in Europe 6 months or so. You also have to remember that the war in Europe was over 6 months before our men were liberated. When the European campaign was over, there was VE Day and the confetti in New York and all the celebration. By the time our guys got back, people had pretty much tried to forget everything and go back about a normal life. So when our guys got back, there wasn't much of a band playing, there wasn't much of a reception, and they were expected, and some of our people were actually told not to talk about their experience. Some men have actual papers that they had signed. Now my father didn't, and most people did, but a lot of people were told not to talk about their experience. So by the time they got home in September and October, it was a topic that was not very important to a lot of people, and our guys would just go back to their hometowns and fade into whatever they did before the war and try to make a life, marry and raise a family and go on with life. So that's pretty much what a lot of people did.
Knowing what I do about my father, he internalized a lot of the damage, for lack of a better word. To be perfectly honest, he became anorexic. He was actually diagnosed with the term anorexia nervosa in 1949. He could not talk about it because he was afraid he would then have a mental record, and mental health was treated quite differently back then compared to where it is now. You know, nowadays they want to know, and you talk it out, and you can have a lot more avenues to go for help. Not back then. It would cost you your job. It could cost you your liberties. So you kept it to yourself. A lot of these men, including my dad, they coped with their drug of choice, which was alcohol. You listen to a lot of the wives, and because they dealt with that sort of drinking, they are very anti-alcohol, which was another whole conflict within the families. My dad didn't know what to do with himself, so like I said, he was career military for the equivalent of 30 years, and mainly because that was all he knew. That was the only structure he knew, and he was, the only way he could function was to have some sort of structure, and that was the structure he knew. He was a very loving father. He, we never did without, but there were signs, and you could see it in a lot of the other guys. And when they got together and could talk, he was always better after going to one of the meetings. But I don't know. I guess I kind of lost the train there, but it was you could see where the scars were being internalized. I think the fact that he lived as long as he did and was as successful as he was, he came to cope with it, but they all had to find their own ways of coping. Mr. Steele was fortunate that he had a talent and could express it in his artwork. My father was never encouraged that way. He kind of fell into things for himself, and I think two of his big stress relievers, which kind of would slow down and put the drinking behind him, were he became a very good golfer. He played pro-am golf for the Army for a couple of years, and he liked photography. And I think he liked photography because it was an art form that involved gadgets, and he always liked electronic gadgets, and that kind of helped him. And plus, when my mother, she was a very compassionate woman and very, very intelligent and highly educated. When he started at Temple, and he started in electrical communications, and he had to take electives outside of his degree program at that time. She goes, well, I'll pick one out for you. And she put him in a sociology class, and he loved it. So he made a whole career change and ended up becoming the director of policy for the Department of Health and Welfare for the state of Pennsylvania. So, you know, some of them took a long time to find ways to cope. Some of them never did. So every case was different.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for maybe one or two more questions if anybody else would like to come up to the mic.
This is not a question, but short remark. Well, partly because I haven't seen any Japanese speak here today. So, I'm not. When in 1945, my father was 7 years old. So, obviously, I read some documents, so I know a little bit about what has happened, but not in a very good position to ask a question. But I just want to say thank you to all to come here, and want to keep the one. We try hard to make never happen this kind of things again. So thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions, yes, we got one more.
My question is for the veterans on the panel now, specifically the children of the POWs. Now, knowing this type of thing that your parents went through, how was it, did your parents try to dissuade you from joining the next war, like Vietnam you mentioned, knowing the type of experience that had happened before?
My mom got very upset because I was in college, and I joined the Kansas National Guard, and we were going to get activated. Everybody knew that, so I was hoping to finish my senior year, which ended up not doing that because we got activated before, and like a dummy, I didn't go to the school and tell them I'm going into active duty, so I got 12 units or 15 units of incompletes. And you know what happens to incompletes after a year? When my year was up, I was still in Vietnam. So, of course, at that point, I didn't care about my 15 units of F, big deal. But anyway, so I got orders for Vietnam, and my mom got very upset because first of all, I didn't tell her. I was stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado with a unit, and we got individually sent to Vietnam. And me and a friend was the first two that got orders, but my orders came out December 26th. And that was the last day my mom saw my dad. He left on December 26th.
Thank you very much. We sincerely appreciate all your stories, your testimony, and you sit here now as a testament to the relationship that Japan and America continue to have, and hopefully in avoiding a monstrous war like that ever again. As a token of our appreciation, if I could ask the members of the Veterans Club to please come forward. We just have a small gift, a token of our appreciation for your time with us tonight and providing the stories of your fathers, husbands, and Mr. Chamberlain. So this is from us to you, and we thank you very much. Start.
Well, thank you so much. We'd like to thank all our guests. We'd like to thank the TUJ veterans, Enrico, Emily, all the student workers, and the Foreign Ministry. There's no one from the Foreign Ministry here? No, okay. Well, we'd like to... Okay. Okay. So, Jose here, all the other veterans. So thanks again, and we very much wish you a wonderful end of your trip in Japan, and thanks again. And thank you, Alex, for sharing this.